To my immediate right is Anna Moreland, herself, like Pope Francis, of Argentinian background. She is associate professor in the Department of Humanities at Villanova University. She earned a PhD in systematic theology from Boston College and is the author of Known by Nature, Thomas Aquinas on Natural Knowledge of God, and the forthcoming book, What's Reason Got to Do with It? Contemporary Theologies of Religious Pluralism. Then we have Father Brian Daley, a Jesuit like Pope Francis, professor of theology at the University of Notre Dame, received BA degrees from Fordham University and the University of Oxford, and an MA and a DPhil from the University of Oxford as well. In 2012, he was awarded the Ratzinger Prize in Theology, which has been nicknamed the Nobel Prize for Theology. And Father Daley is an internationally renowned scholar of the Church Fathers, particularly St. Augustine. His most recent books are The Hope of the Early Church and On the Dormition of Mary, Early Patristic Homilies. And finally, Russell Reno, now editor of First Things magazine, and until recently, associate professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University. Reno is the author of many books, including Fighting the Noonday Devil in the Ruins of the Church and Redemptive Change, Atonement, and the Cure of the Soul, as well as Heroism and the Christian Life and Sanctified Vision, an Introduction to Early Christian Interpretation of the Bible.
So it's been a good year for Argentines. The Queen of the Netherlands is Argentinian. Messi is said to be the best soccer player in the world. And now, El Papa Francisco. I promise that my comments tonight won't simply emerge from national pride. Although I will admit that the minute that I heard Bergoglio, I jumped for joy and went home to prepare a big party of empanadas and Malbec for a lot of my friends. And of course, that evening, the Argentine jokes began to fly. One of my friends told me that it was already evident that this Pope is a very humble man because any other Argentine would have chosen Jesus II as his name. Okay, so there are a lot of Argentine jokes, and I would love to continue, and I could spend my allotted 20 minutes sharing them with you, but Thomas didn't invite me for that, so I'll get serious. I think there's a line that Pope Francis said during his homily on the Feast of St. Ignatius that I think sums up his ministry and his faith. I seek Jesus, I serve Jesus, because he sought me first, because I was conquered by him, and this is the heart of our experience. Francis first heard the call to the priesthood at age 17 in the confessional. He tells the authors of his first biography, "Something strange happened to me in that confession. I don't know what it was, but it changed my life. I think it surprised me, caught me with my guard down." He continues, "It was the surprise, the astonishment of a chance encounter. I realized that they were waiting for me. That is the religious experience. The astonishment of meeting someone who has been waiting for you all along. From that moment on, for me, God is the one who te primeria, who springs it on you. You search for him, but he searches for you first. You want to find him, but he finds you first." Who isn't reminded of the Hound of Heaven here? Francis Thompson. This idea of the Christian life is always one of response to a call or reception of a gift, grounds Pope Francis's religious life and church leadership from where I stand. It is because we Christians have been chosen that we must serve as a door for others to that divine election. I think we can already see a cornerstone of his young pontificate emerging, an ecclesial reform within the church so as to be able to care properly for the poor and vulnerable both among us and beyond our ecclesial walls. While we've yet to see the results of the C8 summit this past month, we have already begun to catch a glimpse of the shape of this ecclesial reform. As many have noted, Pope Francis's ecclesial reform looks to move beyond simply the curia. From his first gestures in St. Peter's Square, he is reviving a sense of collegiality among the popes and bishops throughout the world. And I hope that Michael Buckley's 1998 study on papal primacy that was commissioned by the then Cardinal Ratzinger will serve him as a guidebook in this endeavor. Buckley argues that primacy and episcopacy are fundamentally relational terms that are oriented ad aliud, or to the other. The Pope exercises primacy precisely as a member of the episcopate. Here I'm quoting. The primacy is in service to the episcopate, and the episcopate, including the primacy, is in service to the faithful. Buckley concludes his study by claiming that the primacy is vital to the degree that the episcopate is strengthened and united. It is not a weak episcopate that indicates a powerful primacy. It is a strong episcopate. So also the episcopate is vital to the degree that the people of God it is to serve are actualized. But a strengthening of church governance is not for Francis an end in itself. It is driven by the need to proclaim the gospel anew. During the Holy Thursday Chrism Mass, the Pope said, "Our people like to hear the gospel preached with unction. They like it when the gospel we preach touches their daily lives, when it runs down like the oil of Aaron to the edges of reality, when it brings light to moments of extreme darkness, to the outskirts where people of faith are most exposed to the onslaught of those who want to tear down their faith." Now, a church turned within itself simply cannot go out and preach the gospel to the corners of human experience. Let me give some examples of Pope Francis's acute sense of responsibility toward the poor and vulnerable among us. Now, the first set is going to be drawn from his time as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, where he himself walked out to the corners of his beloved city to meet its most poor inhabitants. British journalist Paul Vallely argues in Pope Francis Untying the Knots, one of the gazillion books that just came out about Pope Francis, although I really recommend this one. He argues that Bergoglio's leadership in Buenos Aires was marked by an unwavering concern for the poor. When Bergoglio became Archbishop in 1998, there were 6 cura villeros. Those are the priests that live and work among the slums that surround the city. And by the end of Bergoglio's leadership, that number had multiplied to 24. He regularly celebrated Mass there and walked among the streets in his characteristic simple dress and talked and ate with the inhabitants of these shanty towns. He encouraged the foundation of cooperatives and unions and challenged the dominance of drug dealers who ran and unfortunately are still running these slums. To a young priest who asked him whether he should wear his cassock, Bergoglio responded, "The question is not whether you put it on, but it's whether you're willing to roll up your sleeves to work for others." 3 years into his service as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, Argentina fell into an economic and political crisis that utterly devastated the poor. Now, for a country that historically has distinguished itself by having a thriving middle class, it definitely distinguished itself among its Latin American counterparts. Over half the population fell under the poverty line. The president at the time, Fernando de la Rúa, resigned, and 4 presidents followed in 11 days. During this crisis, Bergoglio spoke on behalf of the bishops who had opened a network of food programs across parishes. He said, "We are tired of systems that produce the poor so that the church can support them." Now, having arrived in the Vatican, the Pope continues to make care for the poor and vulnerable a centerpiece of his homilies and speeches and interviews. He repeatedly reminds us about 2 segments of modern society, the elderly and the young, who have been pushed aside to the margins of human progress. The elderly we don't allow to speak or act, and the poor we don't provide dignity through work. This concern for the vulnerable is rooted in what he calls a theology of encounter. It's not enough, he says, to give alms to people who beg for money. If you don't look them in the eyes, if you don't touch them, you haven't encountered them. You lose the opportunity then to be transformed by that experience. One imagines here that his own experience walking the streets of the Villa Miserias in Buenos Aires has shaped his desire to renew the gospel, not just through alleviating poverty as an NGO would, but through real encounters with poor men, women, and children. Now, I'd like to end with one positive effect of this Pope's convictions about ecclesial and social reform, and then just a word of caution, I'd say, about his method. While I don't predict a full-blown restoration of liberation theology in Rome, I do think that now at the end of the Cold War and after the fall of communist regimes, a Franciscan pontificate could encourage a rehabilitation of aspects of liberation theology freed from their Marxist origins. Now, Argentina was half participant, half bystander in the liberation theology debates of decades ago. It's a atypical Latin American country. I could get into trouble here because this is where Argentines are annoying, but it is atypical in that about 97% of Argentines are of European descent, at least partial European descent, and at least historically it has maintained a vibrant middle class. So it really wasn't a hotbed of liberation theology. But now in the Vatican, Pope Francis can encourage a robust Catholic dialogue that continues to promote acts of charity, but also works to destroy the social structures of sin that put in place the need for charity. I have a word of caution, though, about the method of this reform. From the very first minutes of his pontificate, Pope Francis has started bucking traditions and practices that had been firmly in place in the Vatican, and that's fine. But there are moments, though, where his symbolic gestures demand catechesis and theological reflection and explanation. The Pope's washing of 2 Muslim women's feet during Holy Thursday at a youth prison was, of course, deeply moving and symbolic. But it's not enough to defend this symbolic action, as Vatican spokesman Father Lombardi did, by saying that, quote, "This community understands simple and essential things. They were not liturgy scholars." Real questions, I think, linger about interreligious prayer here. We're also waiting to hear what the Pope means by including women in positions of authority in the church, or what he means by, quote, "a theology of women." I mean, just the term makes me nervous, so I'd like to know what he means. Sorry. Theology of men, I don't know. Okay, I'm going to move on here. Pope Francis's penchant for thinking aloud in and through dialogue reveals a human element that is deeply attractive. And to those of us who think aloud, it's refreshing and comforting to see him, particularly, I think, on video, because you encounter that much more on video than on the written page with him, I think. Catholics will have to get used to this new style, of course, after the German academic approach of Benedict XVI. But Pope Francis will have to be wary that his thinking out loud approach needs to be complemented by some catechetical and theological formation of the faithful. But it's only been 7 months, so let's give him a chance. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you for being here tonight. This is a wonderful turnout for a conversation on Pope Francis. And I think is a sign of the very lively interest that really meets us all around as the world looks at him and tries to guess who he is and what he will be doing as the head of the Catholic Communion. I've been already on a number of panels dealing with Pope Francis, asking him really the same question. What is he doing? What's he about? I guess that's partly because I'm a Jesuit and people assume that I know that I have the answers. And I'll have to tell you right from the start that I don't, that I'm as excited perhaps as the rest of you to see what develops in the course of the next months and years as we have this new style and approach, this new set of priorities from the Bishop of Rome. But I must say, and not just because I'm a Jesuit, that I'm very impressed so far by pretty much most of what I've seen, all of what I've seen. happened to be in Rome myself during the week that Pope Francis was elected. This was totally an accident. I was giving some lectures at the Pontifical Oriental Institute there, and I had been asked to do this months before. When Pope Benedict offered his resignation or his retirement several weeks before this week of the conclave, I quickly emailed the rector of the Orientale and said, surely you don't want me to come when it's likely there'll be a conclave. But we went back and forth, and he said, well, we don't know exactly how the timing will work. We don't know if it will be that week, and if so, how long it will take the cardinals to find a new pope. So come ahead and do your lectures, and if something happens, we'll just have to adjust. And he said, if anything happens, if a new pope is elected, you'll know immediately, because the bells will immediately begin going wild all around you. And so it was, as we read in the book of Genesis. It was about 7:45 on a Wednesday evening. We had just had supper in the community dining room. I was up in my room preparing my class for the next day, and the bells across the street at St. Mary Major began going wild. So I knew that apparently the cardinals had reached a result. And I ran down to the community television room, and everybody else did the same thing, and we kind of crowded in, and then waited for an hour until an announcement was made. You may have been watching it yourself on TV here. There were a lot of shots of a seagull sitting on the top of the chimney where the white smoke had poured out, but otherwise not a clue to what had happened. And then when the Cardinal Deacon announced that the new pope was Cardinal Bergoglio of Buenos Aires, I guess the only description of that room was stunned silence, you know. Everyone just sat staring at the screen. And I think one reason is that Jesuits have been brought up always to assume that whatever happens, there will never be a Jesuit pope. I have heard this many times. I have said it to many people myself. I think we assume that we had too many enemies in the church and the world, but also that being bishops and being a pope is not really what we do as a normal thing. In fact, in the constitutions of the Society of Jesus, St. Ignatius laid down that Jesuits should normally refuse offices in the church, should not seek promotion to positions of power, and should only accept them if commanded under holy obedience to do so. Obviously, when the cardinals elect you as the Bishop of Rome, that's a command in holy obedience. So I think Cardinal Bergoglio felt that he was left little choice in his response. But I think most Jesuits found it astonishing, maybe a little scary, but certainly fascinating to think that even one of our own brothers had been elected now to this position in the church. How has he turned out so far? Well, Anna has kind of touched on this, and I think we'll all have a chance to reflect for ourselves. Clearly the media are very favorable, which is not always to be guaranteed. They have a narrative which then determines the way everything else is to be presented. Just as they had a narrative on Pope Benedict, which tended to be rather negative and totally unrelated, I think, to who he was and what he did. But there we have the way that news is generated these days. I think what to me is most striking about Pope Francis first, as Anna said, is a change in style, a change in priorities perhaps, a change in his emphasis as spokesman, as leader, as center of the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. Even that famous first presentation to the people in St. Peter's Square that you mentioned before, I think set the tone for that. He appeared in a white cassock, certainly, but a little bit less ceremonial in his dress than some previous popes had been, and referred to himself consistently there as the Bishop of Rome, which of course is what he is. But I think it was a way of signaling perhaps a return to what is most central about the role of the Pope in the Church, that he is not a monarch, he is not a counterpiece to the emperor, but as Bishop of Rome, he occupies a unique place in the communion of bishops and the communion of churches. And that episcopal status, that episcopal ministry, really, I think, has been determining a lot of his style and his emphases since that day. There also, I think, is a kind of personal style that communicates itself very well. An unstuffiness, an insistence on being a servant of the poor, on doing what he can do for himself. And apparently his record as Archbishop of Buenos Aires was very consistent with that. He actually did walk to work and talk to folks in the street and do his own cooking. And in general, try to be an ordinary citizen in contact with other ordinary citizens. This is not necessarily significant, perhaps, for the leader of the Church's faith, but it suggests a personal style and spirituality, which I think is significant and which is important. The spiritual exercises that really form Jesuits to be what they are, I think in a very central way emphasize humility as the central virtue of the Christian and as the central way of being identified with Jesus personally. Ignatius, I think, draws very much in the spiritual exercises on the second chapter of Paul's letter to the Philippians, where we hear of the Son of God, one who was equal to God, as not considering that role something to be clung to, but as emptying himself to take on the form of a servant, the form of a slave among us. That image of the self-emptying Son, of the humility of God, which is an Augustinian theme, really, is very central to the spiritual exercises, and I think to the spirituality of Jesuits. And to me, at least, it works itself out strikingly in the way that Pope Francis speaks about himself and encourages others to understand themselves. We read also about his work as Archbishop of Buenos Aires as being a time when he really learned a great deal. And he says this himself, that it was his encounter with ordinary people that transformed his way of thinking of himself. I've just been reading a book by Paul Daley, an English journalist and theologian that just appeared in English. And he's talking about the time of Cardinal Bergoglio as Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And he says, over 18 years as bishop and archbishop in Buenos Aires, one priest of the slums estimated that Bergoglio must have personally talked to at least half the people in the slum at visits where he would just turn up, wander the alleyways, and chat to the locals and drink mate with them. It's when we are involved in ministry that we discover who we are, Michael Campbell Johnston said of him, an English Jesuit who has worked a lot in South America as well. And I think that experience of being the Archbishop of a large and sophisticated middle-class city who reaches out to be in touch with simple people is something that's clearly printed him and imprinted his life, has given a kind of direction and an understanding to what he does. A few other things that seem to me key emphases so far in the way that Pope Francis has behaved. One I detect in many of his writings is a kind of allergy to elitism. It's interesting to see how often Pope Francis has mentioned elites as something that can be dangerous in the life of the Church. Excuse me. Not that one can get along entirely without them. We're probably forming one ourselves here tonight. But it's something that I think he realizes can be dangerous for the life of the Church. He speaks, for instance, in one of his early addresses to his fellow Jesuits when he was provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina, as saying, clarity about ourselves protects us by forcing us to face the temptations that we already know too well. An occasional moralism, a propensity to various forms of elitism, a fascination for abstract ideologies that sadly do not correspond to reality. What does he mean by that? Well, I have a sense, at least, that when he talks about elites and elitism, he's thinking of academic elites, clerical elites, bureaucratic elites, socio-political elites. He's thinking of academics who think they have the answers to things, of clergy who assume that this is given to them with their office, of bureaucrats whose job is to manage others and to manage the work of church and world, of social theorists and economic theorists, of Marxists, of others who have answers, they think, to all the ills of society. And so Bergoglio, even in his time as provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina, apparently was very suspicious of what was then known as liberation theology, because it was, at least in its early stages, largely a movement based on Marxist analysis and drawing on the work of European scholars and applying them then to the situation of Latin America. He has had the reputation also among other Jesuits in Latin America of being somewhat anti-academic. A friend of mine who was an economist who has worked on the economic situations in Brazil and Argentina said he met him one day as Archbishop when he went down to do a conference. And Cardinal Bergoglio, as he was then, said to him, "Now, what do you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm an economist at such and such a university in the United States." And Bergoglio said, "Wouldn't it be better if you're doing some kind of ministry?" And my friend, kind of took a double take at that and thought, what is he really trying to communicate to me? But I think there is kind of prima facie suspicion that if you come down to Argentina as an economist, you could be somebody who thinks he has the answers without talking to the people who might know. His remarks about the clergy being almost inherently not self-promoting, but self-referential, as Anna quoted in his famous Holy Thursday homily, bears this out, I think, too. There's a tendency in all of us, but especially in the clergy of the church, to be self-referential in our understanding of ministry and of ourselves. He's repeatedly reminded the church that the church is not an NGO. The church is not meant to act in a bureaucratic way in society and bringing answers to the world's ills. And all of these things, I think, reflect a certain uneasiness, at least, with our modern tendency to turn to the experts and to see ourselves, at least potentially, as experts with answers to things. A third quality, which I think is closely linked with this, is the emphasis that he has made on developing a greater synodality in the church. Synodality is one of those words that gets thrown around perhaps a good deal more than it should. But in his interview with Father Spadaro from the Civiltà Cattolica, which is translated and published in Jesuit periodicals around the world simultaneously, you may have seen it in America Magazine in this country, they talked a good deal about how he sees his future ministry as Bishop of Rome, as Pope. And one of the things he says is we must walk together, the people, the bishops, and the Pope. Synodality should be lived at various levels. Maybe it's time to change the methods of the Synod of Bishops, because it seems to me that the current method is not dynamic. And this will have ecumenical value, especially with our Orthodox brethren. From them we can learn more about the meaning of episcopal collegiality and the tradition of synodality. And I think he's right on that, having been involved in Orthodox ecumenical conversations for a long time. So an emphasis on collaboration with his fellow bishops, on taking advice, on working with representatives of other religious traditions in a collaborative way, this seems to be an interest of his that is developing as his pontificate goes on. Another element, perhaps a fourth element in what Pope Francis has said so far that seems to me also significant, is his emphasis on the whole church, including uneducated and simple people, as really the bearer of a faith that is of its very nature infallible. If you look at the definition of infallibility at the First Vatican Council and its reinterpretation and reaffirmation in the Second Vatican Council, you can see that the norm for the infallibility of the Pope and of the bishops in council is that infallibility with which Christ intended to endow his church. That's the way it's expressed in the documents of the First Vatican Council. And what the council is affirming there, I think, is the conviction that when the church as a whole shares a conviction about God, about Christ, about human salvation, and has done so in a perceptible way for a long time, that conviction is guaranteed by the presence of the Holy Spirit to be something that is essentially true. It may need to be reformed, it may need to be re-expressed in other circumstances, but it doesn't need to be changed in substance, reformed in its very assertions. I think Pope Francis has tried to assert that in some of his recent statements. I mention again the America interview that he gave that was published a few months ago, where he talks about this infallibility of the faith of the church as something that he considers really essential to an understanding of the church. He says the people itself, the people of God, constitutes a subject. And the church is the people of God on his journey through history, with joys and sorrows. Thinking with the church, therefore, is my way of being a part of this people. And all the faithful, considered as a whole, are infallible in matters of belief. And the people display this infallibility in credendo, this infallibility in believing, through a supernatural sense of the faith of all the people walking together. This is what I understand today as thinking with the church, of which St. Ignatius speaks. When there's a dialogue among the people and the bishops and the Pope, and it goes down this road and is genuine, then it's assisted by the Holy Spirit. So thinking with the church does not concern theologians only. That sounds perhaps rather radical, and yet if you think about it and look at it, it's in fact highly traditional. But it's something that perhaps hasn't been sufficiently emphasized in recent years for the theologians and the thinking of the church. A few weeks ago, about 2 months ago in fact, my little community at Notre Dame had an Argentine Jesuit staying with us, a man who is himself a political scientist and studied in this country, and comes once or twice a year to give lectures and run classes at Notre Dame. He's a wonderful character, larger than life, as many Argentines are, Anna. Someone who's Spanish I can hardly understand, but who speaks with a very self-expressive style. And of course, as soon as he came, we pounced on him and said, well, tell us about Pope Francis. What are people saying in Buenos Aires? And he said, well, of course, they're tremendously excited. The newspapers, the television, every day are carrying something about him. But we said, what do you make of him? And he said, well, when he was provincial, and then when he was archbishop, he got, in some ways, mixed reviews from many people. A lot of people found him a bit too authoritarian, a bit too strong, quick to make judgments. At the same time, he's clearly a man who lives very simply. The poverty is genuine, he says. He really does want to identify himself with the people. But Rodrigo, and that's his name, said to us, to understand him, you have to remember that most prominent politicians in Argentina are Peronistas. He says, Juan Perón, and maybe Anna wouldn't agree with this, but Perón, who was the president and in some ways dictator back in the 50s and early 60s, set an example of a very strong central government, which was essentially populist. A government that took very seriously the needs of poor people, disenfranchised people, unions, others who were somewhat marginalized by the elites. And he said in Argentina ever since then, you've had very often presidents and prime ministers who are Peronistas. Now you have Peronistas on the left, he said, and Peronistas on the right. The present president, President Kirchner, Cristina Kirchner, forgive her, he's a classic Peronista of the left. She's a Marxist and so on, and cultivates the support of the people. But he said while he was there, the cardinal was always her opponent as a Peronista on the right, affirming kind of standard Catholic teaching on family and on the structure of society, but also doing it as a populist, as someone in touch with the people and stressing the fact that we only teach these things because they're ways of preserving the interests of the people. Now, I don't know if that's accurate or not. I've never been to Buenos Aires, but I think it's an interesting suggestion to see him, in a sense, as a populist bishop, steeped in the Ignatian tradition of humility, and also identifying himself with Francis of Assisi and with the work of the Church in opposition to the kind of implicit elitism that is so present to us in many different ways. I think there are questions that his style has raised for us. One of them is that I think he's perhaps been a little bit too ready to give interviews and to speak without a lot of preparation. And so some of the statements that are made are at least open to very different interpretations in the media and the press. He's generated, even as Pope, a lot of criticism as well as a lot of approval. But that will, I suspect, continue to mature as his style has matured. And I have to confess, and I suppose I'm prejudiced in his favor, but I find what he is saying to us and the direction he's leading us in as something that inspires a lot of hope for new developments in the Church, for new developments essentially of style and of emphasis in the way we reach out to the poor and in the way we preach the gospel of God's mercy. One could say a lot more, but I think I should make room for my friend Rusty to share his opinions with us. Thank you very much for being here.
Pleasure to be with you all. A Dominican friend of mine, after the election of Pope Francis, told me that this was something that he never anticipated, which is a Jesuit who agrees with the Pope. I want to talk about kind of the response of the sort of the American scene, the Western scene, to Pope Francis. So I'm going to not try to talk about what he really is thinking or really is trying to achieve, but instead to speak about how he has been received, how he's been interpreted in our context. It's kind of a reader response thoughts about Pope Francis. Specifically, I want to try to think about the secular liberal enthusiasm for Pope Francis. The New York Times, I think, is very enthusiastic about this particular Pope. And also the conservative Catholic anxiety about this Pope. And this has a lot to do with us and our situation. In the West today, the Catholic Church is the single largest and most important moral authority that's in the way of the progressive agenda in culture. We're in the way of abortion on demand, we're in the way of doctor-assisted suicide, we're in the way of euthanasia, we're in the way of reproductive technologies, we're in the way of gay marriage, we're in the way of a lot of things that the secular world wants. And obviously, the thought that the Catholic Church would abandon the field in these cultural battles is very exciting to secular liberals. That would be something that they, I think, would greet with great enthusiasm. So there's a sentiment abroad that maybe this Pope is going to get the Catholic Church out of the way. So that's, I think, one thing I want to bring to the surface about how he's being responded to. Now, on the conservative Catholic side, I think that conservative Catholics, I entered the Catholic Church in 2004. I was an Episcopalian, but I taught at Creighton University from 1990 to 2010. It's a Jesuit university in Omaha, Nebraska. And I think I can testify that many conservative Catholics suffer from what I call post-traumatic stress disorder. It was very difficult and a feeling that they were abandoned by the Church's leadership in the 1970s and into the 1980s. And a feeling that everything was up for grabs and that the bottom had fallen out. And I think that when they hear the Pope speak and the change of emphases that Brian Daley, I think, has rightly, and Anna Moreland both have rightly identified, that I think the conservative Catholic, and I would count myself among them, is anxious. sort of, and again, one of my friends, George Weigel, told me just to cool it and get over the Jesuit experience at Creighton University. And it's kind of a post-traumatic stress disorder. I really think that that's actually part of what is at work in how conservative Catholics in America are responding to Pope Francis. So it has a lot to do with about us. A lot of how we respond to him has a lot to do with about us and our interests, our history, our concerns. So it's with that framework in mind that I want to make kind of remarks on 4 different topics about how that scene, that dichotomy between the liberal, secular enthusiasm, conservative Catholic anxiety, how it gets stimulated in the case of Pope Francis. First point, Pope Francis has never been to the United States. He's not U.S. focused. And so at one level, it's really not about us, a lot of what he's talking about. He's concerned about development, urban poverty, the kind of problems that face the developing world, South America, Africa, Asia, and so forth. Anna Moreland pointed out rightly that I think it is reasonable to suppose that there will be some kind of rehabilitation of liberation theology of some sort, precisely because of his emphasis on the poor. But I would suggest that liberation theology was never very relevant to Germany or the Netherlands, and it was minimally relevant in the United States. And so its rehabilitation is not something that's demanded of in the West. I mean, it may have something important to teach us, but it's not an urgent issue in Germany to deal with a kind of grinding urban poverty that leaves people on the brink of starvation. It's really not a problem in German society. It's a fairly well-developed welfare state that's a well-funded, well-developed welfare state. So he's not focused on our issues and our concerns. So I thought to myself, I'm kind of here, I'm feeling a little bit, I'm the conservative Catholic, kind of anxious and thinking like, well, wait a minute, this is not helpful. And I thought, if I was a Nigerian Catholic under Pope Benedict, I would say dictatorship of relativism, forget that. We're worried about the dictatorship of Sharia. He's not really helping us by focusing on the dictatorship of relativism, us Catholics in Nigeria. So it could be that we have to face up to the fact that it's not about us in many instances. I think that helps explain why he's being over-interpreted or interpreted in all kinds of ways anxiously and enthusiastically. The second kind of aspect of his papacy that I think contributes to this situation. I think Brian Daley, and both Anna and Brian have mentioned his unstuffiness, his simplicity. We're dealing with someone who I think has what I would call a charism of immediacy, of presence, immediate kind of presence to people in an immediate way. I mean, he gives these interviews that are unprepared and uncensored. One does not have the feeling that one is dealing with an American politician who has lots of handlers around him that keeps him relentlessly on message. This is not the kind of person we're dealing with. Dealing with someone, and I think this is characteristic of Jesuit spirituality, who trusts himself to speak with integrity for the faith in a kind of direct and immediate way. And this element of simplicity and stripping down, I think is also characteristic of the Jesuit tradition, is a kind of focus on the one thing needful and not to let perfectly good and in many cases quite positive elements to get in the way in certain circumstances. So you have Matteo Ricci, you have somebody like Ricci in China who can let go of so much for the sake of witnessing to the gospel. And I think we see that in this papacy. And it's appealing to people, this element of immediacy. I mean, I don't know what it's like here in Chicago, but when the President of the United States comes to New York City, it's like a small army moving through the streets of New York. This is not, to my mind, it's troubling to me. and that Brian has spoken about his concerns about elites. I think our leaders are very far removed from us. And there's something very powerful about his immediacy and the fact that he's actually speaking to us as a person and not as a talking head or as someone who's speaking from a teleprompter. But of course that charism of immediacy often leads him to say things off the cuff that aren't sort of thought through in terms of how they're going to be spun by the secular press. There's not a lot of spin control in this papacy. I think that contributes to his reception here in the United States. He's a person that the New York Times can in fact isolate certain quotes from, and Laurie Goodstein, the religion reporter at the New York Times, can write a piece about how finally we have a pope that's going to realize the real meaning of the Second Vatican Council, in effect make its peace with the progressive secular agenda in the West, because he's not doing spin control. Third point, or third aspect of what I think contributes to his reception. And here, the first two I think are kind of aspects of style and where he's from. This is really substantive. And it marks an important disjuncture or a certain discontinuity between the papacies of John Paul II, Benedict, and then Francis. Pope Francis puts an extraordinarily strong emphasis on what he's for and really does not speak very much about what he's against. He does speak against consumerism and things like that, but if we look at John Paul II, I think that his signature phrase was the culture of death, something that he was deeply concerned about in the West. And the signature phrase of Pope Benedict was dictatorship of relativism, another problem, and something he was deeply concerned about. And of course, they're linked together, I think, the dictatorship of relativism and the culture of death. Now, of course, both men had tremendous things to say about what the Catholic Church is for. Both men engaged in lifelong dialogue with contemporary secular philosophy in the case of Pope John Paul II. And then Pope Benedict, obviously, before his election to the papacy, had a famous encounter and dialogue with Jürgen Habermas, which really, if anything, kind of bore witness to the spirit of Gaudium et Spes. Certainly that did as well. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that both men had a kind of steely spined resistance to what they thought was wrong in the contemporary West. And this Pope doesn't seem to have that same concern to emphasize what the Church is against. And instead, many of his remarks, he talks about, that everyone's in search of God, and part of what your pastoral ambition is to, if you will, to find that little ember and then to blow on it and try to make it into a flame. That seems to be what his vision. And that's a difference. And I think in that context, it does look like a kind of retreat from the field. I think it's misjudges. I think love affirms, but love says yes first and foremost, but love also says no. Anybody who's a parent knows that love says no, even if the no is always in the service of a greater yes. And I think obviously Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict both affirmed that. But still, there is this difference. And I think it has something to do with the fact that we're seeing a change in generations. John Paul II and Pope Benedict were both formed decisively by the great trauma of the 20th century, World War II. And they endured and encountered and endured a kind of palpable evil that was concentrated and had to be met head on. And I think that's one reason why they had this kind of urgent, articulate, and sharp thrusts against what they saw as the evils of our age. Cardinal Bergoglio kind of came of age in a different time, post-war context. And although Argentina had the dirty war of the 1970s, I would submit that it wasn't as clear. The battle lines, or the lines between good and evil, were not as clear. And I could imagine being a pastor in 1975 in Buenos Aires as leftist terrorists were doing their work and as the junta was doing its work, thinking that my ministry really should be to try to find the good that was there and try to make it increase. It wasn't clear what the way out was from the dirty war. So I think that has something to do with it. But I think it's broadly characteristic of a generation, the generations that come after John Paul II and Benedict, to have a different orientation towards the struggle of good and evil. I think this is probably healthy for us. I would argue healthy for us, not to imagine that the struggles that we face are kind of apocalyptic contests between good and evil. That the secular world that we're opposed to has many deadly tendencies, and the culture of death language is, I think, apt in many regards, but it also does many good things that need to be affirmed and nurtured and encouraged. So, the final kind of point that I think encourages the secular liberal enthusiasm and the conservative Catholic anxiety. Pope Francis uses the typical rhetoric of the post-Vatican II church. And this rhetoric is a kind of rhetoric of the sort of closed versus the open, closed-minded versus open-minded, the sort of dogmatically traditional versus the engaged, those who fear change, those who have the courage to encounter history, those who those who are complacent at the center versus those who are active on the margins. And of course, that great buzzword, dialogue. This is the typical rhetoric of the progressive left, that both secular and Catholic left. And so it cannot help but give the impression, as he sings out of the progressive hymnal, he sings tunes out of the progressive hymnal, it cannot help but give the feeling that finally we've got a pope who's going to sort of join hands with progressive secular, the progressive secular agenda. That's why I think the New York Times editorial page is so enthusiastic. He's talking like us. And this is why I think Catholics who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder like me are going, oh no, not call to action circa 1975. We feel like like I said, the kind of return to the dark times. And I think that this rhetoric, which he uses, I think casually, not systematically, which he uses intuitively and not with any particular agenda, I think, and this is kind of my closing thought, I think that this rhetoric was the default rhetoric. It was part of the rhetoric that emerged after the Second Vatican Council as the Church tried to find its way to a new kind of theological vocabulary to replace what was seen as the failed scholasticism of the Church before the Council. It was a kind of ad hoc set of vocabulary, but the fact of the matter is that the Church really hasn't come up with an alternative to this vocabulary of the 1970s that I think the Pope kind of defaults to. I would argue that the Church today lacks a coherent, ordinary theological culture, and that Pope Francis's statements, which can be so easily taken out of context, reflect this lack of a coherent, ordinary theological culture. In that sense, he really is speaking from and for the Church. He's a man of the Church. He's a man of our times. And because the Church lacks a coherent, ordinary theological culture, his own statements, when they're not, we'll see what the magisterial documents look like, his encyclical letters look like, they may fall back on a more technical theological language, but this kind of theological culture is quite not fully functional in the Catholic Church. This doesn't mean that the Church doesn't have coherent doctrine, of course it does, or that the magisterial teaching of the Church is somehow disordered, of course it's not. Nor does it mean that the post-Vatican II Church lacks a coherent witness. In some ways, I think that aspect of the Church has gelled very well, and I think his attempt to clarify that witness will be very important. What I'm really saying is that theology isn't doctrine, it's not magisterial teaching, it's not witness. Instead, theology is a kind of fluency, so that you conjugate your verbs, you ensure agreement, and you use the right prepositions, and so forth. And I just think that we, since the Second Vatican Council, have yet to find a coherent, ordinary theological language. And so this Pope, who speaks with such immediacy and directness, reflects that lack of a coherent theological culture, and therefore his interviews and so forth present to us a kind of more fragmentary voice that can then be co-opted in various ways, or isolated in various ways. So thank you very much.
I could just add to something that Rusty just talked about, because I think it's not just that secular liberals perhaps have co-opted some language, and Pope Francis has given the opportunity for sort of opening splashy lines of the New York Times. But it is also the case that Pope Francis, when he was in Buenos Aires, could assume a very conservative Catholic ecclesial structure, very conservative Catholic society, as the people to whom he was speaking, so that there's a fluidity when Argentine Catholicism is not American Catholicism, not even close. It's quickly unraveling. It is quickly unraveling, but he can say things in an Argentine context that get misread, I think, in an American context, get misread by secular liberals who are, I think, unwarrantedly enthusiastic. And I think some conservatives are unwarrantedly worried. And I think I hope that this will play itself out, and I think that Pope Francis will realize that on the world stage, he's got different ears listening. So that's one thing I'd like to say. And then I would also like to say to Rusty that certainly as Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he spoke out against Cristina Kirchner and Nestor, and her husband, when he was president. I mean, he refused to go to the Te Deum masses after, for Pope Francis, it was the crushing of the poor that was the issue, right? I mean, and I'm happy for that to be the byline of this pontificate, to be against the crushing of the poor on the world stage. So I guess I just would disagree that he's not against something. He's just against something different than the prior two popes. That's it.
You know, I have a question also in terms of the Argentine context that, Pentecostalism presents a serious threat to the church. So poor rural folks, often kind of Indian descent, that are nominally Catholic, come to Buenos Aires and other cities in this sort of relentless process of global development. It always leads to urbanization. And in that context, it's often the Pentecostal churches that wind up actually meeting their spiritual and material needs. And they don't, so, whereas in the United States, the trend is really the unchurching of the poor. They're not being stolen as sheep, they're being unchurched. And so it's so the idea that the church needs to, get to its sort of evangelical core makes sense in any context, but it really makes a kind of, there's a special poignancy to that in the Argentine context.
Sure.
Think that's accurate?
Absolutely.
I just add to what Rusty was saying before, which I agree with. I think that we've seen, though, in at least the last two pontificates, the pontificate of Pope Benedict as well as Pope Francis, a certain period in which they're learning to be a public figure on a totally different level and landscape than they were before. And one only thinks of Pope Benedict's famous Regensburg address, for instance, which is a brilliant address if you read it, and a very interesting speech, but it was about epistemology. It was about faith and the scientific mentality and the way we come to certainty. It was not about Catholic-Muslim relations, and yet somehow was distorted by its reporting in the media and made something different from what it was. And I think Pope Benedict there and a few other times had to learn to consult his handlers a bit more carefully before making statements. And I think
That's a good point. That's a very good point.
Pope Francis is doing, will have to do the same thing, I think. I mean, that you could say things as Archbishop of Buenos Aires that you can't really say anymore as the Bishop of Rome. You have a different group of cameras watching you. So I think your point about our lack of a theological vernacular is a good one. And I'm not sure how one could replace that, but I think it's true that given our present social conditions, people do speak in very different tones. Having said that, though, I think there's something important about the emphasis that he's been giving to the fact that the Church's preaching of the gospel of Christ is essentially not simply a theological exercise, but is a way of proclaiming the love of God and the transforming mercy of God in the world. This doesn't rule out theological interpretations or the acquisition of a theological vernacular, but it's a way of saying that really what we're doing in the end is to try to preach the kingdom of God to people. And to do that is not a return, I don't think, to post-Vatican II trendiness. It really is something that's been central to the Church's life since the 2nd century, since the 1st century. But there are different ways of expressing it and emphasizing it, and perhaps this is different from what his predecessors did. But I think a point that he's trying to make, and successfully so far, is that the Church is not essentially a player in the culture wars. The Church is not a ideological entity representing certain political or socio-political positions. The Church is here to make the love of God available to people in sacraments and in the Word. And that's not just a glib generalization, it really is what we're about. So to remind us of that, I think intelligently but discreetly, is perhaps healthy all the time.
Should we get questions from our...
Well, whatever Michael would like.
Can I just say something to Brian?
Do you want to say something more on that?
Yeah, just one more thing.
Yes, go ahead. We have a lot of time.
Okay, good. So, Brian, I would just want to follow up then on your Argentine Jesuit friend and say
You may
that,
totally disagree.
Sorry?
Maybe you totally disagree with
I do. I
position.
completely disagree.
Okay.
Well, and I would just use your final reflection as an example of that. I mean, it is not, I don't think, that Pope Francis is a Peronist that gives insight into his concern for the poor. I mean, it is hard, if any of you know Argentine immigrants to the U.S., you know, the key question is always, what year did you move here? So it's hard for me to distance my own family background that's very anti-Peronist from what I'm about to say, but I think it's true. When Archbishop Bergoglio spoke out against the Kirchner government, I mean, he spoke out very strongly and very consistently against his own party. And granted, the word Peronism, it's hard to know what it means today. But I think his moral authority in Argentina and his commitment to sort of in what we'd call in the U.S. family values are very easily wedded to his concern for the poor because of his Ignatian spirituality and Catholic faith. I just don't see them emerging from his political concerns.
Well, I think. Well, I think that what my friend was trying to say, which was clearly a rhetorical exaggeration of kind, was rather that, there's a populism in style which runs across party lines and divisions, and that his understanding of the preaching of the gospel or social ministry or the church's ministry tends to be, a populist one rather than one that draws on European political categories or others. And I'm not in a position really to judge that, except to say, at least a lot of what I read sounds to fit that category.